And today in this video we're going to be looking at how communities change over time, which is something called succession. And I'm pretty sure, hopefully you guys have seen this before in your freshman biology class. So basically succession is just this process where a community, again the community being the collection of all the species in a given area, develops slowly over time, and the species composition of that community changes. So the way this happens is that the initial species that are there alter the environment somehow, and that makes it changes the environment so that the species, there are new species that can then colonize the area because of how the former ones have changed it. So as it says here, as more species arrive, the earlier species are usually outcompeted and replaced. And what's interesting about succession is this tends to happen in a predictable pattern. So there are two types of succession. There's primary and secondary. So pretty straightforward. So first, primary succession. Obviously, it doesn't always look exactly like this, but here is kind of a general depiction of primary succession. And what's key about this, I guess, are first the beginning stages, and you see exposed rock here. Okay, so this is one of the main differences between primary succession and secondary succession is what happens in the beginning. So here it starts with rock, and gradually this rock has to somehow be transformed into soil. So the lichens and mosses that form on the rock afterwards begin to break down those rocks, and then you can get weeds, and basically more complex types of plant species are able to grow, and you eventually end up with a climax community, which is usually a forest, depending on, of course, what type of biome you're in, but it often can lead to a forest. Okay, so because, as I mentioned, we have no soil present, primary succession is the type of succession that occurs in areas that are previously uninhabited. So it might be, a new island. It might be a place where a volcano has erupted and lava has spread out everywhere, and it's now kind of cooled, and so there's absolutely no soil. Or they're just bare rocks, and for some reason maybe the environment is changing, and or it's a newly formed mountain or something, and again, you don't have soil, so you have to start building this vegetation from scratch. Okay, so the general pattern is you start with lichen that form on the rock, and they secrete acids that then start to break that rock down, and that begins the process of soil formation. And then you can get mosses, grasses, and shrubs and forests. So pretty straightforward, kind of, in this zone here, you have the mosses, and the grasses especially are very tolerant of sun. Seedlings of shrubs, but especially of trees, don't tolerate the sun well, so they can't establish very early on, and they also need more complex soil. But as you get more vegetation that dies and decomposes, and you end up, that contributes to soil formation. And then once you have shrubs, you are then providing shade for seeds of trees that will then be able to establish themselves. Okay, so here you can see just kind of three pictures here showing, you start off with, again, kind of the top of a mountain where you have just rocks, and you can see there's some plant forms starting to grow, but very kind of low-lying and small mosses and lichen on the rocks, and then you get the shrubs in picture 2, and then finally a climax community at number 3 where the trees are able to establish. So again, these are the three kind of steps, or three general steps towards getting to a forest community from not even having soil, just rock. Okay, so secondary succession is, pretty similar except for the starting point. So instead of starting in an area without any soil at all, you start with soil. And this happens, this is, probably more common because it's in areas where you're not starting, from a lava field or from a new island or the top of a mountain, but an area that was disturbed. So maybe an area where there was a big fire or a hurricane, sometimes even abandoned farmland where, the succession has been prevented from taking place because um, the constant planting and mowing and tending of all the fields, and you're basically preventing any trees from taking place as you weed and create an agricultural field. So, of course, secondary succession would occur more rapidly than primary succession. And if I were in class, we would be, opening up to you guys to think why it would happen more quickly. But since we're not, essentially, if you think about, that you're starting with soil, that is a huge time saver. Soil takes a really long time, thousands of years sometimes, depending on the ecosystem and the biome. Soil takes a long time to form. So, if you think about rocks eventually turning into soil, it's hard to even imagine that is possible because it is such a long time frame for that to occur. So, that is why secondary succession can occur much more quickly, because you already have the soil. You already have the soil there. Okay, and then this is just another picture. As you guys know, I love diagrams. So you have this one here, another one. Again, you start off with weeds and seeds of species that can tolerate the sun and can grow in the sun. If this, seed, birds would be dispersing this, or wind would be dispersing seeds this entire time. But if they landed in the area when it was like this, they wouldn't be able to grow. One, because it was too sunny, and two, because the soil probably didn't have enough nutrients in it. But once you start to get these species established, your seed that falls there will have some more shade, and will be able to grow. And also, once those plants die, again, you'll be able to increase the nutrients in that soil, which will make it more likely for a tree species to survive. Okay. And you can see this is 150 years or so after cultivation. So it's, again, very long time frames. And you also have succession in terms of aquatic biomes and environments. So again, this happens over hundreds, if not thousands of years, but essentially it's kind of the filling in of a lake. And basically this sediment accumulates over time, and you eventually will get kind of a bog type of area, depending if it's still kind of wet, or just some sort of grassland with shrubs, and maybe eventually that will become a forest. But it's just something to be aware of, that lakes aren't always going to be lakes necessarily, if it does get a lot of sediment, and ecosystems change over time. Okay, and so do the species composition for other reasons, not just the plants. And the last part of this chapter goes into how what determines kind of species richness, and again, richness being the number of species, what determines the numbers and types of species in an area. And kind of like population growth, it's determined by, well, actually this part isn't like population growth, but there are three things that will change the number of species in an area. One is the rate that species are created, and two is the colonization by new species, and three is the loss of species from that area. So the creation of species in the area, the colonization of new species, and then the losses from the area by extinction. Kind of surprised that it doesn't actually say the loss of the area of species from the area by kind of the opposite of colonization, or emigration. That obviously could take place, but once a species is in an area, it's probably pretty unlikely that it would be completely completely gone through emigration. So those are the three things that kind of determine the number of species in the area. And then what actually determines those three factors? These are affected by latitude. So you can see in this diagram here, this regards is referring to the number of species. So those areas that are closer to the equator have more species. So latitude, again, that orientation going like a ladder, the rungs of a ladder horizontally. As you get closer to the equator, you're going to have more species for reasons that we've talked about in previous chapters. You have more productivity and that sort of thing. Also the age of the community. So with regard to this succession idea, the more complex communities have more kind of microhabitats. You know, trees have different layers of the forest, and you're going to be able to have more niches. So you're going to be able to have more species that can kind of, as we talked about in class, kind of partition those resources. And then the last two are habitat size. So bigger habitats tend to have more species in them. And then distance from other communities. So communities or areas that are very remote are going to tend to have fewer species than areas that are closer to kind of a source of species. So these last two here get into a theory called island biogeography, the theory of island biogeography. And this is pretty cool. This this theory became popular in like the 1970s, I think, and basically it was really important for conservation. And scientists found out that, and they looked at, you know, first islands, given the name, but they looked at the number of species on different types of islands, and they found out, again, size and distance here. Okay, so size and distance from the mainland, and so this is how it is referring specifically to habitat size and distance here. Okay, so an island that is bigger and closer to the mainland is going to have more species than an island that is small and farther from the mainland. And you can see in this graph here, the island area is directly correlated with the number of bird species on that island. So bigger islands have more species, and this has been reinforced, and this theory has, you know, there's been a lot more data to support this theory since it began, and it makes sense. I mean, an area that is larger has more, you know, the populations on that island can actually be bigger, and so each species is kind of more robust, and also they're more, in a larger area you have a more diverse set of microhabitats and potentially different types of ecosystems, so you can have a more complex collection of habitats on one given island. So that's going to definitely increase the number of species. And then let me just see. Okay, yeah. So and then in terms of the distance from the mainland, if you think of colonization from mainland as being a source of species, those islands that are very far from the mainland are going to have a much lower chance of getting species kind of randomly migrating from the mainland, as opposed to an island that's very close. The chance of a bird flying onto that island are much higher. The chance of, you know, something floating on a bark or whatever and happening to come onto the island are much higher if it's close to the mainland than if it's farther away. So very, very remote islands, you know, think of the extreme of very, very remote islands, very small, is going to have much lower species richness than one that's very large and close to the mainland, where a lot of species can come over from the mainland. So what's interesting about this is the implications for this idea that started with islands, like literal islands, to looking at habitat fragments. So kind of theoretical islands in a mainland area. So these are kind of thought of as, you know, habitat islands or forest fragments that are islands within a greater matrix of ecosystems. And if you apply the theory of island biogeography to it, you can think that those fragments, or quote-unquote islands, that are larger are going to have a higher species composition, a higher species richness, a more thriving community than those that are smaller. And also those fragments that are closer together are going to fare better. So this gets into this idea, and this is what I have here, Yellowstone to Yukon. There's a Y2Y conservation initiative to basically connect through corridors, using those habitat corridors, connect all of these, you know, quote-unquote islands together with conservation corridors, so that you can connect the islands and have them exchange species and really keep the ecosystem more healthy and vibrant over time. So this theory of island biogeography has really extended into the conservation realm, and has been very helpful in advising conservationists of how to protect areas and preserve species richness. And I think that is it. Yep, all right. And there will be a game point quiz on this video in class, so make sure you, and it's pretty basic, but make sure you get it so you can get as many game points as